Hi everyone, today we are going to be continuing rangeland types. So make sure you have your note sheet handy. I provided you last rangeland lecture and fill in the important information as we go. We'll also be talking about the plants of the week for this week, week 4, Bromeae, and also we will start the plants of the week for week 5, Poeae. That way we'll have some time to do different activities next Friday. So last time when we left off, we talked about the global or the US range types that were grasslands, as well as many of the desert types, as well as some shrublands as well. This time we are going to be moving into different types of forest and woodlands, which again are the last 4 on your rangeland note sheet. And you should be thinking as we go through this about the precipitation, soil, livestock production, wildlife quality, types of vegetation communities, and special considerations for management. So just a reminder before we jump into oak woodlands, we stopped last time at chaparral, which are special desert shrublands, typically with low precipitation, with very arid soil, aridosols, soil types, typically poor for livestock production. Typically, you can only range goats, sometimes sheep. Cattle really suffer in these types of environment, and it's pretty good wildlife habitat as well. It has a specialized vegetation community, which includes Coniferous shrubs, which are just plants that have really thick or hairy leaves to prevent water loss. And you can look at our last lecture if you're unsure about that. And also in terms of management, fire is really important for the right balance of fire is really important for maintaining chaparral ecosystems. So for oak woodlands, we have a precipitation that is typically more than 700 millimeters, and this rainfall usually falls in the late spring and early fall. And again, woodlands and forest ecosystem types or range types are typically characterized by high precipitation. Soils can vary widely, but typically oak woodlands will have well-drained soils. In terms of vegetation, as the name suggests, it's an oak woodland, so it's dominated by oak species, which is in the genus Quercus. When you see SPP after a genus name like Quercus, it means it's referring to multiple species in that genre. When you see just SP after a genus, or then you know that it's referring to a single oak species that wasn't identified to species level. So in terms of management, typically these habitats are managed for wildlife. They provide good wildlife quality. They provide good habitat for wildlife, and they also provide good grazing and livestock production for cattle, sheep, because they're also moderately resilient to grazing disturbances. Next up, we have Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands, which are primarily in the southwest, in generally arid environments. Often pinyon junipers are a result of overgrazing in semi-arid grasslands. And oftentimes pinyon juniper is considered one of the lowest forage quality, rangeland qualities for livestock production because it's so full of woody species and has very low cover of grass understory. So pinyon juniper woodlands are typically, like I mentioned, in arid environments, and so they often have very low precipitation from 300 to 450 millimeters. Soils, again, are in arid regions, so they consist primarily of entisols and aridosols. The dominant vegetation, as the name suggests, includes a lot of juniper species as well as pine species like ponderosa pine, and also sometimes includes gamble oak. Oftentimes, like I mentioned, it's pretty low quality forage for livestock because there's so many woody species, and oftentimes it doesn't really support a highly productive understory of forage or grass species. Pinyon junipers are also an important habitat that we consider for management because it often encroaches and expands on high quality forage producing grasslands that we typically might want to keep open for cattle or other livestock. Fire plays a really important role in managing this ecosystem type, and range expansion has typically happened because of an absence of periodic fires and a history of fire suppression. as well as climatic change and more droughts, as well as lower rain and warmer temperatures. And again, this range type is expanding and encroaching as a result of fires, again, some fire suppression and because of overgrazing. This habitat occupies the southern U.S. With almost all of this, about 70% of Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands being managed federally, specifically by the Federal Forest Service. This is a really important rangeland type for mule deer, and it makes intermediate wildlife habitat, and again, is not great for livestock. Tree removal, on the other hand, can really help increase forage production for livestock and wildlife by providing open areas for forage and grass species to grow a little bit better. So next up, we have coniferous forests, which again are not necessarily always the best for forage production, but they can be useful for other reasons. In terms of precipitation, similar to many other woodland types, very high precipitation, typically higher than 700 millimeters. Soils are typically classified by unisols and spodosols, which again are highly leached soils. And highly leached soils means they're typically low in nutrient content and a little bit more acidic. Vegetation, again, as the name suggests, typically consists of coniferous trees and some understory plants. Although, again, these understory plants typically aren't good forage quality species. In terms of management, they're mostly managed by the U.S. Forest Service, and it's really important for multiple use. And so coniferous forests have been really important, especially for big game animals and hunting recreation, as well as other recreation activities like camping and backpacking and just enjoying aesthetic views. But it can also, in certain areas, sometimes be important for cattle production in kind of more open habitats. And it's also important for the water table, water quality, and for protecting important riparian habitats. And here you can see that that I've listed that this type of habitat type is typically better for sheep than cattle because of the amount of room and how essentially herding cattle work. And so usually if there's a lot of obstacles in between, cattle don't really do that well. So the final rangeland type we're going to talk about in a lecture is the southern pine forest. You may have also heard from the guest lecture, they mentioned eastern deciduous forest, which yes, is one of the rangeland types listed in your book, but we're not reviewing it because it's pretty low in forage quality and it's not really an important point of focus. Because as mentioned, a lot of the rangelands are irrigated pastures in the Northeast, kind of created through clear cutting of deciduous forests. So the last one we're going to be focusing on for our lecture is going to be the southern pine forest rangelands, which typically occur in Florida as well as in along the East Coast. So southern pine forests have the highest precipitation of all U.S. rangeland types, which typically are classified by higher than 1,250 millimeters of rainfall. Water typically doesn't limit recovery from grazing, but instead, because it's so high in rainfall, oftentimes the soils are highly leached, which cause mineral deficiencies for forage production in a lot of the years, or during much of the year, not in a lot of the years. And because of the high rainfall, like other forest ecosystems, they typically are classified by ultisols and spodosols. In terms of forage quality, like I mentioned, because of this issue with mineral deficiencies, the forage is not always the best for livestock production because it also results in mineral deficiencies for livestock animals. And so oftentimes you'll have to supplement with mineral salt licks and other things like that. In terms of management, this is nearly all in private ownership. And so a lot of the ranching and livestock production that happens on these rangelands typically are through private landowners. Fire is also a necessary management tool to keep these southern pine forests open and producing forage in the understory and from preventing it from becoming too dense. However, it is a highly productive rangeland, and you need less than 1 acre to support one animal unit in this type of habitat. So next, we're going to move on to the plants of the week. First for week 4, the week we're in right now, and then also for week 5, Poeae, which would normally be discussed next Friday. So this is just a nice little description of the genus Bromus, which is what we're going to focus on within the Bromeae tribe. And we heard a lot about this tribe today, with the guest lecture from Chris Bartow, talking about issues with cheatgrass in Nevada and Great Basin range types, and also Bromus diandrus, Ripgut brome, also a huge problem in California rangelands. So Matt Levine, or Lavin, however you say his name, basically describes the genus Bromus as native and introduced, mostly bunchgrass species, and some which are rhizomatous. Brome grasses all have conspicuously fused leaf sheaths, and often the lowest 1 or 2 sheaths have a conspicuous covering of downy hair. So that means they're very fluffy and very hairy, but soft and not rigid, not in like the type of hair that stabs you. The lemmas of brome grasses are often distinctly hairy and ribbed. Often you can see the venation well, and they produce well-developed awns just from the back of the lemma tip. The shape of the lemma tip is the length of the architecture of the lawn, and the length and the architecture of the awn are taxonomically important in the genus Bromus. If you're unsure what the term bifid means, it essentially just means there's like a little divot at the end of it. The lemmas of Bromus also loosely envelop the palea and the fruit, the latter of which often functions as a dispersal unit, and the flora of North America often separates the genus Bromus into the grass tribe Bromeae, which is what we're going to be focusing on. So within the Bromeae tribe, you're going to be responsible in this class for knowing about Bromus diandrus, Ripgut brome, found on page 74, and Bromus tectorum, also known as cheatgrass or downy brome, found on page 80. And one really common characteristic that really distinguishes this tribe is their hairy sheaths, which we'll go into a little bit more detail in the following slides. So the genus Bromus, we're just going to broadly talk about the genus Bromus first. And so you can see a figure here on the right side of the slide that kind of shows some of these characteristic things that I've been telling you about that is about to pop up. So first we have the Bromus V-neck. So if we look at the sheath and where the leaf blade meets the sheath, we'll typically see that it opens at the apex. So that's at the very top of where the sheath meets the leaf blade. And then as you go down the sheath, it causes a connate margin, or essentially it becomes fused for the remainder of the length. And so it causes a V-shaped look when you're looking at the node of the grass opposite of where the leaf blade is facing. And oftentimes, like I mentioned, you look at the junction of where the leaf blade and sheath is to kind of figure out the apex. And again, you would expect it to be open there. And then as you go down the culm, you'll notice that it forms a V shape. And again, typically the sheaths themselves are very hairy in the genus Bromus. So now that we know some general characteristics of the genus Bromus, we're going to focus specifically on the first grass, which is Ripgut brome, also known as Bromus diandrus. So again, we're going to go over the important things you need to know potentially for an exam, a quiz, or a midterm. So to start off with, it's an annual plant that's non-native and introduced from Europe. The inflorescence type is considered a panicle, and the spikelets themselves typically have 4 to 8 florets. The lemmas are always awned, and the awned are stout often relatively long, ranging from 4 to 6 centimeters, and barbed. So if you look very, very closely, if you have a large screen on the slide, you'll notice that there's tiny little hairs on the lemmas and the awns, that's the barbed that we're talking about. And so you could see it essentially right above me, right here in this picture with the grass that's green, and you can also see it in that photo kind of in this direction that is brownish and is under a finger. And so if you look closely, you'll see like there's this little white hairs, and those are the barbs that we're talking about. In terms of vegetative characteristics, it typically grows solitary or cespitous. And as I mentioned, the sheaths and the blades are hairy, and in this case, we call it pubescent with spreading hairs. And so pubescent typically means a plant is covered with short, soft hairs. So if you've gone out before and you felt a plant that's hairy but also soft at the same time, that would be considered pubescent. You'll also sometimes go out, you'll feel a plant that's hairy, that's not soft. That's not pubescent. So you need to know that term specifically. In terms of its growth characteristics, it's a cool season plant, but it grows rapidly. Again, it germinates when it first rains in the fall or winter, and then it grows rapidly in the winter as well as in the spring, and then it's at seed. It reproduces only from seeds. And in terms of forage, it's good to fare for livestock before it flowers, but essentially becomes worthless at maturity because of these long awns that are unpalatable and because of the barbs on those awns. It's actually called Ripgut brome because we think that as ruminants and other animals chew it, the barbs might actually hook on inside their mouths and in their guts, in their throats, and actually kind of cause micro cuts and different types of injuries. And so oftentimes it's not really great forage, especially once it's mature. However, it's adapted to nearly all soils, and it's a highly invasive, noxious species. Again, this is just a close-up look of the kind of awn and the barbs that I'm talking about. Like, this isn't a macro photo, so you can't see it that well, but you can begin to see at the zoomed in kind of feature right here-ish, that there's little white little hooks coming out of that awn, and that's the barbs I'm talking about. And these barbed awns often can cause losses in livestock, and can also be an issue with wool production. And so one way we try to remember Ripgut brome is through a mnemonic device, Bromus diandrus, or Bromus diandrus is dangerous. So you can try to remember that if you like, if you're having a hard time remembering plant names. So next we're going to talk about another incredibly invasive grass that functions very similarly to Medusa head, as Chris Bartow mentioned, where it rapidly transforms ecosystems, rapidly invades, and changes the fire cycle, which again causes increased fire frequency, higher fire intensity, and then causes a positive feedback loop that eventually leads to massive invasion by cheatgrass and displacement of a lot of native vegetation and a reduction of wildlife habitat. So cheatgrass, in terms of its stats, it's an annual plant and is introduced or non-native from Europe, as I suggested when I said it was invasive. And the inflorescence is typically a panicle type, and the panicles typically are dense, and they're many branched, and they're also what we call nodding, which you need to know. That's why it's bolded, which means it's essentially just kind of hanging over the end, nodding with the wind. And oftentimes the awns are a little bit purplish, as you can see in the photo directly above, all the way above me. And they're also flexuous, which means when you look at these panicles here, they're flexuous, which means they are flexible and they can move around without breaking. So the spikelets typically consist of 4 to 8 florets, which again are not hairy, which we call glabrous, which we talked about in a previous lecture. You'll need to know that term as well. And oftentimes the spikelets will be hirsute, and that's a different type of hairy. It's also short hairs, but typically these hairs are straight and stiff, And so they might stick in your hand or arm and irritate you. And so this is not the type of hair you like on a plant when you go out and touch a plant and you say, oh, it's so soft and nice to feel, I could rub it on my face. No, you don't want to rub this on your face. It's going to probably give you a rash. So that's hirsute, straight, stiff hairs. Again, you need to know some of these terms. The lemmas also are awned, which again is characteristic of the Bromeae tribe and the Bromus genus. And the awns typically can be straight or they can be curved. Vegetatively speaking, it can be a solitary plant or a cespitose plant, depending on the soil type. Oftentimes you might wonder what makes a plant solitary or cespitose. Well, plants that grow in really high nutrient or high water environments typically have the energy and resources to become cespitose and create a bigger kind of basal bunch, whereas plants that are growing in kind of more arid or low nutrient environments or in high densities with intense competition tend to be a little bit more solitary and just put up a single stalk. The leaf blades, again, are this term we use, glabrous, which means they have no hairs, and it's hispid, which is another way to say hirsute, which is, again, straight, bristly, straight hairs. The sheaths, though, which again cover the culm and meet with the leaf blade, are often hairy but in a pubescent way and often feel soft to the touch. Oftentimes, because it is so pubescent and soft along the blades and sheath, we actually call it the fuzzy grass. So in terms of growth characteristics, the plant cheatgrass is a cool season plant and it reproduces from seeds, but it can be a really aggressive weed like Medusa head. It also grows rapidly, like Bromus diandrus. It germinates in the fall or winter when it first rains. It grows rapidly throughout the winter and spring, and it produces an enormous amount of thatch or litter, which is basically dead plant material sitting on the ground, which again affects fire frequencies like Medusa head, and also prevents other native plants from germinating through that thatch or other desirable forage species. And so, similar to Medusa head, there's some major issues with cheat head in terms of management, and oftentimes it's a major management concern for rangeland managers across the country because it can really, again, rapidly transform systems, change fire cycles, increase fire frequencies, make them more intense, and just essentially cause degradation of important rangeland habitats like sagebrush steppe and California native grasslands. And in terms of forage, we don't really like that because it's only relatively good for livestock before it starts flowering or producing an inflorescence with those long awns. Pretty much after it flowers, it becomes worthless feed for the livestock species. And so not only are we concerned about how it's transforming ecosystem services and processes and fire frequency, but it's also not even great for livestock. So it's a big management concern that we're trying to figure out how to approach. But at least game bird seeds that are important for hunting can eat the seeds, so they can provide some small habitat value. And again, similar to Bromus diandrus, it's adapted to nearly all soil types because it's incredibly invasive, similar to Medusa head, not great forage quality, and can rapidly transform in habitat and ecosystem to favor increasing its own population and abundance over the existing vegetation. Okay, great. So now we've covered all the material for week 4, including rangeland types and the plants of the week, which include the Bromus tribe or Bromeae. What you'll be responsible for the midterm is all the material up to what I just covered to the end of week 4, which includes, again, up to rangeland types and Bromeae, the plant tribe. Now we are going to be moving into new material that is not going to be on midterm number 1. That way, just so we can be very clear, and the midterm actually isn't going to be occurring for at least 2 more weeks, but that's by design to allow you to have a lot of time to study. So just so you are aware, we are now moving on to week 5 material, Poeae, which is not going to be on the first midterm. Right now might be a good stopping point also to take a break and maybe go through some of the recording as needed to fill in your U.S. rangeland types note sheet or your plants note sheet, which I didn't print for you in class, but you should be able to access on Canvas. Sorry, I didn't mention on the last slide, but so for Poeae, we're going to be focusing on 4 plants in this tribe, and that's going to include Dactylis glomerata, which is on page 160, Festuca idahoensis, which is on page 164, Poeae pratensis, which is on page 168, and Poeae secunda, which is on page 170. And here's a note from Matt Levin, however you say his name, on the tribe Poeae. It's not that useful. It basically says all other grasses that don't fit well into a cool season tribe, like Aveniae, Melicae, Stipiae, and Tritiaceae, are all basically Poeae because they couldn't figure out how to classify them better. So our first plant up from the Poeae tribe is Orchardgrass, Dactylis glomerata. This is a very common plant, non-native, in Humboldt County, and so you may have seen it around before. In terms of stats, it's a perennial plant, and it's also a non-native introduced species from Eurasia. In terms of its inflorescence type, it's typically panicled, and the lower branches often spread more, and the upper branches often are a lot closer to the pedicels are a little bit shorter. The spikelets typically consist of 2 to 5 florets, and they're nearly sessile. And so again, another fun plant term. So sessile, essentially, so it says nearly sessile, so this is not sessile. So if you see my mouse here, you could see that there's a very small little appendage that is connecting these little florets to the spikelet. And so if you didn't see like this very small little appendage here, then that would be considered sessile, and the floret is right on the rachilea. But in this case, there's a little bit of an extension, which makes it non-sessile, but nearly. The glooms and lemmas are often what we call mucronate, or also known as having short and sharp awns, which you can't really see in this image because they're short and small, and you would have to really have a close look. But if you do look at this image, you can kind of begin to see these really kind of small, very small awns that look pointed and looks like they could potentially be sharp. And so that's what we mean by mucronate. If you're interested in seeing more plants that have something that look like that, you can look up California spine flower, and those are I can't even say it, mucronate. Yeah, so short, sharp awns. Vegetatively, they are cespitous plants. So again, that means they're bunch grasses, they're bunchy, and sometimes they can produce rhizomes, although that's generally pretty rare. The culms are typically what we consider erect, so they grow straight up and typically are rigid. And the leaf sheaths are typically shorter than the internode, often leaving kind of a bare area above the nodes, in between the nodes and where the blade comes out of the sheath. In terms of growth characteristics, orchard grass or Dactylis glomerata, again, is considered a cool season grass, and it reproduces from both seeds and tillers. It's often, although it's actually, well, we'll get into that next, it can also be very vulnerable to drought and cold snaps. So it's really vulnerable to weather variation. It doesn't handle really dry conditions well. It also doesn't handle freezing well, which is what we consider a cold snap. However, in terms of forage, it makes great to excellent wildlife and livestock forage and can help produce important early spring forage when other plants may still be growing or still small. And oftentimes it dries well, cures well, which means it dries well for hay production. However, forage quality does rapidly decline with maturity as it becomes less palatable and less nutrient rich. And again, this is a very common plant around our area and also very important for livestock forage. Next, we have Idaho fescue, also known as Festuca idahoensis, and this, rarely, we have a native plant, so that's awesome. This is a rhizomatous plant. You may be familiar with it if you've hiked much in the King Range. It occurs a lot around there. That's on some of the mountain grass ranges. So Idaho fescue, or Festuca idahoensis, is a perennial native grass, and the inflorescence is a panicle type. Typically, the panicles have very narrow and loosely contracted florets, and so you can see the panicles and kind of the drier image. You can see most of them are contracted, which means they're just barely angled off of that stem, and that creates a narrow kind of inflorescence look. Oftentimes the branches are ascending and lower branches are spreading. So again, that means some of these kind of upper ones that you see in this kind of close-up view are typically ascending, going upwards, and then the lower ones, the lower spikelets on the inflorescence are often spreading kind of lower down on the inflorescence stalk, the panicle. The spikelets typically consist of 4 to 7 florets, which again are laterally compressed. And so this is talking within this kind of like little bunch right here. Within this spikelet, these florets are laterally compressed against the rachillia, which also give it a somewhat narrow look to them. The lemmas are awned from the apex, which is at the tip of the lemma, and these awns are typically straight and range from 2 to 5 centimeters. And vegetatively speaking, these plants are typically cespitose, as you can see in this image right here. Makes a really nice bunch. And the leaves are mostly basal, which means they don't actually grow up along the culms and out like you traditionally expect, but they actually grow out of the base of the plant. The culms themselves typically are erect, and usually it produces culms when they're flowering. The culms are also, again, what we consider glaucous, which we mentioned in a previous plant lecture, which means it has a bluish gray green look to it when it's fresh, not when it's dry and dead like it is right above me. The sheaths, you can see more details or an illustration on page 164 of your book, but typically the basal sheaths are typically wider than the actual leaf blade because the leaf blades typically roll up and become really thin looking. And the sheaths are often persistent, and you'll usually see dead sheaths on the plant from previous years, which will often have a dryish look to them. The blades themselves are what we call filiform or thread-like. So first off, it makes very narrow leaves, and then the leaves typically tend to fold or roll up on themselves and make needle or thread-like leaf blades. And that's what we call filiform. And the leaves themselves are also glaucous, like the stems or culms, which again means they are bluish gray or bluish green gray in appearance. So in terms of growth characteristics, oftentimes Idaho fescue or Festuca idahoensis reproduces from either seeds or tillers. It can also withstand excessive grazing, which helps improve its forage quality and actually makes it excellent forage quality for both wildlife and livestock. It typically occurs in high elevation areas that are typically rocky in terms of its soil type, and it's a cool season grass. Like I mentioned, in terms of forage, it makes excellent forage for both wildlife and livestock. And it's also important in the late growing season because it often stays greener than a lot of other plants in these areas, especially because kind of high elevation rocky sites are often very dry. And typically Idaho fescue occurs in rangeland types in the west, kind of close to where we are, like in Palouse prairies in the Pacific Northwest, in the cold desert basins, in Nevada, and a lot in California native remnant grasslands, especially here in Humboldt in the King Range. So here again is Matt Levin on this time the genus Poeae, not the tribe Poeae, which again, Poeae is a conglomerate of all the plants they couldn't classify into other tribes. So Poeae itself, the genus of bluegrasses, is typically characterized by lemmas that have inconspicuous veination, so you can't see the veins very well, and acuminate tips, which means they kind of come up here and then they become like a very thin needle that points upwards. And they never really have any awns. The leaves fold in half because the two longitudinally parallel lines of cells on the upper surface on either sides of the midrib make them naturally fold, and the lines of the cells uptake water to unfold the blade and release, and then they become unfurled. So here is a field of Kentucky bluegrass or Poeae pratensis. It's very commonly used as a lawn. So believe it or not, you probably have interacted with this plant a lot of times. So Kentucky bluegrass or Poeae pratensis is a perennial plant that is also a non-native introduced species from Europe. The inflorescence typically is a panicle, which often creates what we call a pyramidal shape that is very open and with long branches that kind of essentially form a pyramid, as we see in the photo over here. The lower branches are typically in whorls of 3 to 5. A whorl means that there are stalks or leaves coming out of the main culm, or in this case, the pedicel. And so here we could see on this image, there's about 3 of them coming out right here, also 3 here. And so typically that's very normal. Typically there are about 3 or 5 that come out in that area, in those areas on the panicle. In terms of the spikelets, they typically consist of 3 to 6 florets, which are nearly as wide as long, which we describe with a term called ovate. So ovate means it's nearly as wide as it is long. Lemmas and blooms are what we call keeled, and keeled is essentially something that is shaped like the keel of a boat, which is kind of like a V, like a hard V. And typically, like I mentioned in the last slide or a couple slides ago from Matt Levin, Poeae plants typically do not have awns, and Poeae pratensis does not have awns. Vegetatively speaking, it's a rhizomatous plant, and it's very extensively rhizomatous and often is sod forming, which often is why it's also used for lawns. Like I mentioned, the blades have a double midrib, and the apex is keeled, which often cause the leaves to naturally fold in half. In terms of growth characteristics, it's a cool season plant that seeds both in the early spring and late summer, depending on water. It typically will go dormant in dry summers if there's not enough water, because it typically does prefer moister soils. It often reproduces from seeds, tillers, and rhizomes, and again is densely sod forming, which is why it's very common as a lawn grass species. In terms of forage, it's actually pretty good for livestock and wildlife in the early spring because it greens up before a lot of other plants. But you might recall from the last slide, or not, that's okay, it's a pretty low growing plant, and so because of that, it often doesn't make a lot of really highly productive forage. It is often, for that reason, also undesirable in hayfields because it is kind of low growing and basically takes up habitat space for kind of taller growing hay species that you might harvest all at once and bale together. However, it is able to withstand continuous heavy grazing, which helps provide and improve its forage quality, and also makes it a great lawn grass because, mowing the lawn is a lot different than grazing in terms of how the mechanical action is working, but it is somewhat similar. So that's why it's often used as a lawn grass as well, is because it can really handle continuous heavy grazing. And our final Poeae plant of week 5, which again is next week, is Sandberg bluegrass, also known as Poeae secunda, another rare native grass. So Poeae secunda is a perennial native species, and its inflorescence, again, is also a panicle. And it's often also narrow and contracted. So you can see on my whatever side right here, the panicles are often very contracted and kind of oppressed up to the culm. Oftentimes they will be yellowish to greenish, and sometimes they can actually even be purplish in color. And again, as is Poa, it doesn't have any awns. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So anyways, on the branches, there's typically 2 to 3 nodes, and again, they are contracted and also right up against the culm or the panicle, and that we call oppressed. So when it's all pushing upwards onto the culm or the panicle, that is oppressed with an A. So the spikelets themselves are typically consist of 2 to 5 florets that often form a cylindrical, I guess, shape or form around its rachilia, or sorry, around its kind of smaller panicle that branches off of the main panicle. The spikelets often can have a purplish color, and so if you look at the tips on this side of the image, you can again see kind of the purplish tips on those florets. And again, because it's a Poa, it doesn't have any awns. Vegetatively speaking, it's strongly cespitose. So again, that means it is a bunch grass, and the leaves are mostly basal, which again means they're growing out of the ground, out of where the roots are growing, and it's not coming up out of a culm where a leaf blade might meet the sheath, for example. Nodes are often or occasionally reddish, so that can sometimes help you distinguish it from other species. And sheaths are typically persistent and last throughout the season, and sometimes into a future season, and so it can stay on there as a dry looking sheath. The blades themselves also have a double midridge, and the apex is keeled, again causing the leaves to naturally fold. In terms of growth characteristics, also this is going to be our last slide aside from announcements. It's a cool season grass, and it's kind of important because it's one of the first to start growing early in the spring. And because of that, it can help provide early forage for livestock. It can reproduce from seeds and tillers, and it's often considered a drought-tolerant plant. In terms of forage, it makes good forage quality or forage for cattle. It's all right for sheep and deer and pronghorn. It typically remains green and stays good forage throughout the summer if there's sufficient moisture around. And it can also withstand some moderate and heavy grazing, which again kind of make it a little bit better for forage quality. So that's it for the plants we have for this week and the rangeland types. So hopefully you're able to review that, and I know I didn't go necessarily as slow as desired, but the lecture technically has about 7 minutes left, so you can pause along the way and take notes as needed. Okay, with that, I just want to end with a few brief announcements. Thanks again for watching the lecture and accommodating for the field trip I have to offer to Science 100 on Friday when this lecture is normally given. And also again, thanks for your patience with the confusion for Quiz 3 and Quiz 4. Originally, Quiz 3 was named Quiz 4 and Quiz 4 was named Quiz 3. I've now reversed and corrected the names and the due dates. And so you should be completing your Quiz 3 that is due this Sunday, 2 days from this lecture. I'll release the lecture before Friday, so if you're watching this, keep that in mind. But this is due on Sunday, 2 days from the lecture. And your homeland essays are due tonight if you're watching it on Friday. If you're watching it on Wednesday or Thursday, then remember to turn it in on Friday. Okay, with that, I hope you guys all have a great weekend. Make sure you get your assignments done. If you have any questions, send me an email. Otherwise, I will talk to you and see you all on Monday.